Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to, on this beautiful day in Aspen, have all of you being willing to be in this big tent speaking with us, and not just out on the trails, but I hope you make some time for the trails too. My name's Indira Lakshmanan. I'm the Senior Executive Editor at National Geographic, and before that, a longtime foreign policy correspondent. And we have an incredible panel of experts for you today, and I want to get right into it, so I'll make the bios very brief. Robin Wright, who I first met on a Bill Clinton trip in Vietnam in the late 90s. You would never know to look at her. She has actually been a foreign policy correspondent for 50 years, has worked in over 140 countries, and she clearly was a baby foreign correspondent. Since the early 70s, has been everywhere in the world and will be able to bring her perspective to that for us, and now writes for The New Yorker and is a joint fellow at the Wilson Center and also the U.S. Institute for Peace. And to her left, Bill Taylor, former ambassador to Ukraine and also special coordinator for Mideast transitions during the Arab Spring period, who is currently the vice president for Russia and Europe at also the United States Institute of Peace, and has a very interesting, he says checkered, I say very colorful career path that brought him to where he is today. He was an Army officer who served in Vietnam and then was a civilian with the NATO mission and then joined the State Department after that in a number of different positions. And right next to Bill there is Kori Schake. Kori, I have to say, gets a special award because she actually flew on a plane for hours from London to come in tonight just for this panel. And as soon as we're done, she gets in a vehicle and goes back to London. So I think that deserves some kind of special prize. And Kori was a senior National Security Council and State Department official under George W. Bush, and she's now Director of Foreign Policy and Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, another Washington-based think tank. So we're an all-Washington panel here, but I promise we won't give you ideas from inside the Beltway. We'll try to make them global. So first, I want to start with you, Robin, with the incredible perspective that you have of the last half century, which I still can't believe, but you do somehow. And when we talk about the New World Order, I feel like there have been so many New World Orders in the last 50 years. I mean, like, where do we even begin? There was, you have chronicled everything from the rise of Islamic nationalism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of dictatorships in Latin America and Southeast Asia, the dramatic opening of China, and that only brings us to like 1989 practically, or the 90s. And I feel like 20 years ago, there were a lot of people talking about the end of history. Although the author of that, Francis Fukuyama, has since sort of recanted having called it the end of history. But a lot of people thought that democracy and globalization had won, like, we're done. What do you see now? Here we are, 2022, the second decade of the 21st century. What trends do you observe in that context?
Thanks, Indira. I'm honored to be on a panel. I'm going to warn you all that I'm the pessimist on this panel. I'm not the one who says, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? I'm the one who says, is there really any water in the glass at all? So be forewarned. Bill is the optimist and Kori is the super optimist. So don't worry. You'll get a wide range of perspectives. So I made my little cheat sheet of what I think the 5 trend lines are. As a journalist, I look at what are the headlines. And in 2022, we all know we're living in a vortex of crises, whether it's a pandemic that has killed some 18 million people worldwide, the largest war in Europe since World War II, the challenge to supply lines that has disrupted everything from computer chips to baby food, the highest rate of inflation, in decades, and of course, that existential crisis called climate change. So we're living not just in a perfect storm, but kind of in a I don't know, pluperfect superstorm. It's a challenge of our times, and it will be with us and define not just the next decade, but arguably the first half of the 21st century. So my 5 headlines. The first is that globalization is unraveling. It is changing the kind of interdependence we have experienced around the world. And just to give you an example, Russian shit makes a difference to Brazil's economy. That Brazil is one of the largest exporters of agricultural products in the world, the largest amount of soybeans. But it depends for fertilizer on manure from Russia. So what happens, we all know about grain. We've all read about how the supply lines, 30 or 40%, I think, of grain comes from Ukraine and Russia. This affects particularly the Middle East. So the kind of fabric, the assumptions we all made about the global interdependence of countries, of continents, has begun to unravel, and we're beginning to see what I call a kind of regionalization and a rule-less system of smuggling and trade to try to accommodate. Globalization was never properly ruled. It kind of evolved with its own steam, who made what connections, what was profitable, and now we're finding the consequences. I think globalization is still, the trend of the 21st century, but we're going to have to go about it with more rules, more of a sense of what the order really is. The second trend is that, and the good news is, that the West is more unified than at any point since the end of the Cold War, and arguably since the end of World War II. And when you look at it, we're actually expanding. NATO bringing in Sweden and Finland. So that's a real sense of Western identity. The problem is the yang of the yin, and that is that the rest of the world is fractured. That when you look at, for example, the BRICS, the major kind of players like Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa, they're more and more the spoilers. They held their own conference on Thursday in the run-up to the G7, which begins today in Germany. And they're up to their own mischief, going their own way. So I think it's something we have to be really conscious of. And related to that is that sense of common values that, at the end of the Cold War, we celebrated this incredible embrace of what is kind of my third point, and that is that democracy's in trouble. The period where the end of apartheid and minority rule, which I covered in Africa, the end of military dictatorships in Latin America, which I also covered, the end of communism in Eastern Europe, East and Central Europe, as well as the Soviet Union. There was this burst, and as Indira said, the wave, the celebration of the end of history. But when you look at what Freedom House has reported this year, only 20% of the world's people live in fully free countries today. For 16 years, we have seen declines in democracy. 3 billion people out of 8 billion people on this earth live in countries that are not free. So while we celebrate a lot, we still have a long way to go. And the problem is that those countries that are in the middle of democracy or autocracy, kind of stuck in the middle, are tilting ever more toward autocracies. And when you look at the issue of leadership, of who's giving the leadership to kind of push us in the right direction, Joe Biden's numbers are sinking, Boris Johnson's numbers are tanking, Macron no longer has a majority government, Italy is in a state of uncertainty and divided over what to do about Ukraine, and Germany's facing a severe economic and energy recession, which in some ways we're all going to be facing. I don't like paying for $6 gas either. So my fourth trend is that we're facing a new nuclear age. We kind of all thought with the end of World War II, yes, there was an arms race, and yes, there was development and proliferation of the nuclear weapon. But we're entering a new age, and on this, Bill and I profoundly disagree, so be forewarned. But North Korea is on the verge of a new nuclear test, which will be the first in 5 years. Iran is now 8.5 days away from being able to enrich enough uranium to fuel a bomb. Now, don't worry. It takes 2 other very complicated steps to actually make a bomb, and Iran has not made the political decision. But the fact is, we could be in for, a wave of proliferation. The Iran nuclear deal is in profound trouble. There's a last-ditch attempt to save it, but The challenge today is also not just from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki type bombs. The real challenge, which most Americans don't fully understand, is from the smaller scale tactical nuclear weapon that has a range of 300 miles, 500 clicks, because we don't have any country near us that has a tactical nuclear weapon. But Russia has specialized in them. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had an 8-to-1 advantage in nuclear weapons over the Soviet Union. Today, Russia has a 10-to-1 advantage over us when it comes to nukes. And so I think it's something that we have to actually think about or be conscious of. That, and there's been a lot of talk about will Putin, use a tactical nuclear weapon, which you don't have to use on the ground. You can use in the air to disrupt communications. You can use it even higher in the atmosphere to disrupt satellite communications, which control, our cell phones, all the things we use. So,
okay, Robin, you've given us so much to chew
okay.
on. Hold the fifth point, because we're so depressed already. We'll come around back to it. So, Bill, is there a counter-argument to this? Robin's made an incredibly convincing case.
Not convincing.
Oh, not convincing. Okay, she's made a case
Let's
about
be clear.
unraveling of globalization, decline of democracy, what's happening to alliances in a fracturing world, and us being on the cusp of a new nuclear age. So what say you to those points?
So let's go through a couple of these things. Let's start with alliances. I mean, Robin acknowledged that alliances, the United States alliances, have never been stronger. NATO has never been more unified. I served at NATO right at the end of the Cold War, when there were only 16 nations, by the way. It was really hard to get 16 nations to agree on anything. And now we got 30 nations, and they're all totally agreed. Even Orban, even in Hungary, they're supporting what we're doing with regard to Ukraine and Russia. So, and it's not just the NATO alliance. I mean, it's the United States and the EU. And it's the United States and the EU and the rest of NATO and the East Asian allies. I mean, you got Japan, you got South Korea, you got Australia, and you got New Zealand. That's a very strong, that's well more than half of the world's GDP. I take your point about population, but in terms of alliances, it's never been stronger. That's number one. Number two, on this question of, which we're going to get to, I hope, on Russia, and does it have anything to offer the rest of the world? Well, actually not. The Russians have no kind of ideology to offer. They've got no economic model to offer. They can't offer security to it. What they can offer is fear. And an attempt to pull neighbors, and even beyond neighbors, into some sphere of influence which they want to try to impose without the ability to do that. So they've got nothing really to offer. The Chinese are on this issue, on the Russia-Ukraine issue, Chinese are kind of standing back. They really are a little embarrassed, I suspect, about that they're Russian partners, not allies, but Russian partners, that are damaging their reputation for caring about sovereignty, caring about territorial integrity. The Chinese say that they do. And here are the Russians violating those two principles and embarrassing the Chinese. So I'll say that the Russians have nothing really to offer on this. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'd love to hear the super optimists talk about these things, is that the United States has really stepped up. The United States has really stepped up in a way that many people didn't expect. Certainly President Putin didn't expect. I imagine that President Xi didn't suspect this. And I imagine both of them are kind of disappointed, surprised that the United States has stepped up and organized these alliances, which I mentioned a moment ago, in ways that are really challenging to those two countries. So the United States has demonstrated that it can lead, and it can, I'll go back to Robert Kagan's, the jungle grows back. If you don't prune, and the United States has shown that we're ready to prune. A little late, I agree with Robert on that, but we've stepped up and we're now pruning the garden.
Kori, you're the helium balloon optimist, I'm told.
True.
So, give us even more optimism, because, I mean, I have to throw at you the question that, as Bill acknowledged, the US was a little bit late in bringing together alliances for Ukraine. And, while Ukraine is now on a fast track, apparently, for membership with the EU, not so for NATO. And I wonder, I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little, but I wonder a little bit what lessons China and Xi Jinping are drawing from our reaction to Ukraine, because I can't help, having been a correspondent based in Hong Kong at the time of the handover 25 years ago, I can't help think about how China has completely shattered its promise of one country, two systems, and upholding for 50 years two different things, and how the world has not responded to what has happened in Hong Kong, a complete destruction and devastation of free speech, rule of law, all sorts of things. So what's the message they're taking from Taiwan? Is this like, okay, well, we could just do it and we'd have to suffer some sanctions, but ... I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to take us off the track. I want to hear
No,
your
that's
global
fabulous.
view first, but I
Okay.
also thought of that.
3 points. First, while it's tempting to ridicule Frank Fukuyama for his book about the end of history, I'm prepared to defend him, because the actual title of the book is The End of History and the Last Man. And what he argues is that there is no better system for the stability, prosperity, and human flourishing than free societies. And the risk to the dominance of free societies in the international order is actually the last man. That is, all of us living prosperous, secure lives who become complacent and too passive to defend our societies and to keep their democracy vital and vibrant. I feel like we are living in the moment where we are being tested whether we are going to be Frank Fukuyama's last man, or whether we are going to prove him right about the vitality of free societies. That's the moment that we are in. And I have to say, actually, we're not doing half badly, right? America's alliances are prospering. 18 months after the end of the Trump administration, which practically every American ally was tremulous that this was going to be the end of American leadership and the end of free alliances. The reason America's alliances are so enduring and so robust, I mean, all of the complications and worries that Robin raises, most of those aren't new problems, right? There is not a mythical golden age in which the world was uncomplicated and it was easy to do these things. Math class isn't newly hard. Math class has always been hard, right? And the United States is not a natural leader of the international order. Yeah. The American public, because we have the grace of terrific neighbors and oceans, our strong temptation is to leave other people's problems to other people. You actually have to win the argument to persuade my mom she should care about the world. And the way you persuade my mom is actually values, right? The truths we hold to be self-evident aren't unique to our society. We believe that everyone yearns for freedom, the right of free association, the right for practicing their religion. And guess what? The two people who believe that most ardently right now are Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, because you do not have to build the repressive societies that they have constructed in Russia and China unless you believe the people you are ruling over want something different than what you're offering. So that's the reason I'm optimistic, because actually I think those dynamics, as difficult as the headwinds are in our times and as difficult as the headwinds have been in others, we still have the right answer for ourselves, and others also believe it's the right answer. That's why you've seen Singapore, Australia, Japan rush to assist in Ukraine, because they actually want to uphold and expand an order that we believe and that we tried to construct after World War II. And the reason they believe it is there's no better system if you are a small or medium-sized power than one in which there are rules that even the strongest power in the international order, for the most part, subscribes to. That really matters. Second, on Ukraine. Yes, we didn't do enough to defend Ukraine, and Ukrainians didn't do enough to get themselves ready to be a NATO member and an EU member. They struggled to tackle corruption. I'm sympathetic to the problems. The transition from a repressive society to a vibrant one is very difficult to make, and it takes a long time. And they have done it fast and well, as we are seeing, right? Right now, the vibrancy of Ukrainian civil society is a thing of beauty. And they are winning a very tough war against Russia. And the help that we are giving, the arithmetic of what's happening in Ukraine, Russia has 80% of its army in Ukraine already. They don't have trained reserves they can send, and they are being ground down in an artillery slugfest in the eastern part of Ukraine, which every single day Russia fires 50,000 artillery shells to terrorize that population. Ukraine only has about 5,000 to 6,000 a day they can fire, and they are holding their own in the east. And the arithmetic on that side of the equation is we and other free societies are flowing them precision weapons of greater ranges. You should have seen yesterday an ammunition dump complete with a Russian 3-star general gets exploded 50 miles behind the line of conflict in Ukraine. That's the difference that Western assistance, late as it is, limited as it is giving Ukrainians hope they can actually prevail at this, and I believe they will. And quickly on your third point on Hong Kong and China's malevolence. A big part of what has reinforced America's alliances isn't our reliability, which is always in question, and always should be, frankly, because we have to win the domestic argument. The malevolence of Russia and China is what's revitalized American alliances, because my whole life working on alliance issues, if I could trade in Britain and Germany and Japan and Australia for better allies, I would be happy to do it. But we don't have any better allies on the offering, and America's allies don't have better choices than us either. So the challenge is that they're bringing what the Chinese look at Ukraine and should see are Western solidarity, the United States willing to pour buckets of weapons to help a free society, the orchestration by the free societies of the international economic order to, Russia's probably going to have to default today, my friends, a sovereign default by Russia
Gold,
today.
they're blocking gold as of this morning.
And the toughness of Ukrainians to fight for their freedom. What I fear the Chinese are learning is if you got to do it fast before the West has the chance to organize. For all the assistance the United States is sending, it is unwilling to run the risk of any American deaths for the defense of Ukraine. So this is not George H.W. Bush in 1990 saying this will not stand. And the anxiety that if we allow this war to drag on into next winter, once heating bills start hitting, particularly European countries, the political challenge of keeping allies in the fight gets much harder.
All right, well, thank you. That's a really good sort of place setting, and it brings us back, Robin, to exactly, I know what your next point was going to be, talking about the uncertainty of U.S. leadership. Now, both Bill and Kori have given an argument that, you know, although we have to make the domestic argument for people to care when there's so much else to care about at home, that our alliances are strong and our ability in the post-Trump era to rally people, rally other countries into united action, particularly, I mean, you've never seen more sanctions than the sanctions on Russia right now. So Bill is raising his eyebrows. I mean, it's a lot of sanctions. There were a heck of a lot of sanctions on Iran, which I covered for years during the Iran nuclear deal, so we'll get to that too. But I'd like to hear, Robin, you know, how do you see uncertainty or U.S. leadership in the world? How do you see that playing out? And if you think there are all these bad trends, what does U.S. leadership need to do to reverse these bad trends?
Yeah. So first of all, you should all know that Bill and his wife and I are all in the same pandemic pod, and we have the same conversation at least once a month. And I often say to him, I want you to be right. I want to be wrong.
My wife is on her side.
Yeah. So they're very interesting arguments. So, you know, when it comes to U.S. leadership, I think one of the problems is the outside world looks at us and says, you know, how reliable are you given your gyrations? And when it comes to Russia, you know, we looked into his soul, and then we challenged him, and then we hit reset, and then we looked not just into his soul, but into his eyes. And now we're basically, you know, fighting a war against him. And the world looks at us and says, which are you? When it looks at Afghanistan, we mobilized a world with, again, unprecedented unanimity behind us. You know, even in Iran, they were holding candlelight vigils in sympathy for 9/11. We got NATO to deploy for the first time outside of the European theater in Afghanistan. We withdrew so abruptly. NATO wasn't even told. And trust me, I was in Afghanistan with CENTCOM on the eve of the withdrawal, and you know, our NATO allies were flabbergasted. When you look at the Middle East, we, for decades, promised we would support a two-state solution, and you know, we're pushing human rights. And Joe Biden is going to go see Saudi Arabia and MBS, the Crown Prince, who murdered and dismembered my friend Jamal Khashoggi. So, you know, when it comes to things, even basic things like human rights, so essential to our values, the world is just uncertain because we went from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, and there's a sense that the center that we once established, we could, you know, whether it's on the Hill or within, you know, the executive branch, or even within the Supreme Court, you know, that we're not there anymore. We can't get there anymore. And so I think that I think Bill's right that and I acknowledge fully, there's never been a Western alliance so strong, but it is just the Western alliance. And the challenge in a globalizing world are to get back to globalization. And just one thing very quickly. Big events like World War II produce institutions and ideas. After World War II, we created the UN and NATO, World Bank, IMF, you know, to give us a pattern of world order. And the problem is, after the end of the Cold War, we didn't do that. We kind of got involved in domestic stuff, Whitewater, and we didn't take advantage of this moment to create new rules. And we're at that juncture again. This is a moment of opportunity. We need to think about how to revitalize. I mean, who talks about what the UN is doing or what have they been able to do on Ukraine? You know, it's kind of our institutionals that we've created are weakened or not as energetic, don't create the momentum or leadership. And so the question is where, you know, how do you take these moments of crises and how do you convert them into something that gives us tangible framework, new rules like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that get us to the next, you know, that help us with the rest of the 21st century?
Well, the sad problem is we're not even, or not we, but the world is not even abiding by the old rules. So forget about new rules if we're not abiding by the existing ones. And, you know, put aside looking into his eyes and pooty poot and nicknames like that. And Bill, I want to ask you, since you're such a specialist in Russia and Eastern Europe, what do you see as Putin's real motives for invading Ukraine? And how and when do you expect the Russia-Ukraine war to end? Or is it just going to turn into a years-long frozen conflict?
So what is Putin doing? What does he want? What is he after? He's after Ukraine. He has very clearly stated this. I mean, we don't have to guess at this one. It's hard to understand this man, but it's not hard to figure out what he's after in terms of this war, at least the first part of this war. The first part of this war is Ukraine. He wants to dominate Ukraine. He wants to absorb Ukraine. He has made it clear he doesn't think Ukraine's a real country. He told George W. Bush in 2008 in Bucharest, he said, George, Ukraine's not really a country. And he said that as recently as just before he invaded. He's written a long document a year ago, almost a year ago, in 7,000 words. He traced why and laid out the history of why Ukraine's not really a country, it's really part of Russia. So that's what he wants. He's also famously said that the dissolution of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the last century, and he wants to fix that. So, and the jewel in that crown of that fixing is Ukraine. So that's what he tried. The first part of the war, he tried to send his troops, ill-prepared as they were, down the Dnieper River to both sides, and he thought he was going to take over and get rid of Zelensky and put a puppet in and control Ukraine. Didn't work. Didn't work. So he's tried something else. Now he's reduced his goals. He now just wants to control, he says, these two little statelets in the eastern part of the country. He's having a hard time doing that. He has recently been able, the Russian army has recently been able to take over these two little towns, countries that we've all been reading about, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and the Russians have bled themselves in those two towns. King Pyrrhus will remember this. You can win a battle and you can lose a war, and he's likely to do that because, in answer to your second part of your question, Sarah, how does this end? One way it might end is the Russian army been in the field now since last December and January, for a long time before they invaded in February. They've been in the field a long time. They've gotten beat up, as I mentioned, around Kyiv, to the north of Kyiv, pushed back out of the country, back into Russia and Belarus, moved around. Same troops that got beat up to the north of Kyiv are moved around to the east. They've been fighting first down in Mariupol, where just a bloody, horrible battle that the Russians eventually won, but again at a great cost to their troops. And now they've been able to move in, doing some in the eastern in Donbass, as I mentioned. They could fail. They could fail. That army could collapse. They're having a hard time getting soldiers. They've probably fired 75% of their precision-guided munitions, and they can't replace them because we are not sending them chips any longer. They can't make them any longer. They have a big problem. I'm not saying that's probable, but that's a possibility. That's one way it could end. And in that case, the Ukrainians push back, push the Russians back out of the land and territory, their own territory that the Russians have taken over the past 3 months. The Ukrainians could push them back and then negotiate. And there's a settlement that could, in that case, where the Ukrainians have the momentum, they could negotiate something that would be left. Now, the slugfest that Robin mentioned, that could go on. That could continue. The Ukrainians are not going to stop. The Ukrainians are not going to give up that fight. They're going to continue to fight. As long as we provide them the weapons and the ammunition and the intelligence and the fuel and the support that they need, they'll continue to fight. I'm not sure how long the Russians will. They can figure that out. Of course, the Russians will. And in this case, maybe they continue to fight it out as long as the Ukrainians will. And that goes on. That's a problem. That's a problem for all the reasons that Robin talked about in terms of the gas prices, the fuel prices, the inflation, the food, the whole business. That's a problem. And that's where it's going to be a test for us. That will be a test for them. So one of those ways it could end.
Okay, well, for anyone who wants to delve deeper into Russia or China, Bill and I, with two experts on China, will be doing that at 4:30.
No, I'm not an expert. Let's be clear. There's a man in the back of the room that is a much better expert than I am. Orville is.
Yes, well, I said with two experts on China.
Oh, very good. Not me. That is Orville.
And so we'll be doing that at 4:30 over there at Greenwald. Kori, before we go to questions, I want to ask you, though, from your defense perspective and having looked very carefully at the defense budget, how does Biden's defense budget right now stack up against the threats posed by China? And I sort of took from your last question that the United States would not be willing to get militarily involved in Taiwan, certainly not in Hong Kong, as we've seen. So what sort of a threat should be prepared for? Is it all about maritime claims in the various seas around China, or what is the threat as you see it?
So for a country with ambitions like our country to be the guarantor of the security of ourselves and our allies, it's not good enough to prepare for one kind of war, because your adversary is always going to poke for your weaknesses and fight the kind of war you don't want to fight. And we have hard experience with that. The Biden defense budget just submitted continues, actually expands on the prior administration's strategy. It's a more demanding strategy, and it was widely considered, included by the last several secretaries of defense and the current Secretary of Defense, that executing that strategy would require a real 3 to 5% increase, so above inflation, year on year, to be able to buy the military force that can carry out that strategy. The budget that President Biden just submitted is built on a 2.5% inflation index. Inflation is currently running 8.5%, so they have a net real 6% reduction in defense spending. Congress has already acknowledged the inadequacy of this, and the Senate Armed Services Committee added a $47 billion increase. And again, that's probably not enough for us to have the ability to carry out the commitments that we've made. So again, the end of history and the last man. Are we actually willing to spend 4.5% of our GDP in order to protect ourselves and our allies, is the question we are being posed right now.
Or have we become too complacent? It's a big question. All right, I want to leave time for the audience. I'm going to take, since there are a lot of questions, I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. Why don't we start with this? This is the first person I saw put his hand up here, and the lady next to him, and this gentleman here. We'll take 3 people in the front row. Okay.
Thank you for your comments. So this is regarding Taiwan, and it's a yes or no answer. Should the U.S. remove the strategic ambiguity as a way of better protecting our ally, and given how important Taiwan is? It's yes or no.
Okay, good. And this lady here.
An out-of-the-box suggestion. Why doesn't she invade Russia now that Russia is so weak militarily? And,
Wow.
and China needs oil.
Okay, that's a surprising one. And this gentleman here in the green.
You speak about adversaries and alliances. How do you foresee the U.S.'s alliances or adversaries changing in the metaverse? And can the U.S. still lead geopolitically?
When you say metaverse, you mean specifically, you don't just mean in cyberspace in
In the
general, you mean
non-physical world.
specifically in digital worlds.
Right, so if like an embassy creates a digital embassy in the metaverse, how can the U.S. still lead?
Okay, good. Let's take the
I'll
first.
take a shot at this.
Okay.
No, we shouldn't remove ambiguity precisely because there is question about our willingness to actually defend Taiwan. And I worry that if we remove the ambiguity, that may prompt China to test our resolve to a greater extent than they are now. Why wouldn't Russia invade China? China's got plenty of... Why wouldn't China invade Russia? China's got plenty of territory they're going to struggle to control, and I'm not sure what invading Russia gets them that they don't already have. And, you know, in the near term, we worry that all of these technologies are advantaging authoritarians. But the ability for people to bear witness and to create accountability is, I think, the long-term trend of these technologies. And we shouldn't lose faith that the creativity, the ingenuity, those Hong Kong protesters who put umbrellas up in front of the, like, people are damnably creative, and that is our long-term safety.
The only thing I'd add on your question is I hope Putin is worried about exactly that. I hope he's got his mind on your question, and I hope he's listening to you on that. They've got a lot of resources up there, not many Russians, and the Chinese have a lot of Chinese right there. Yes, right.
All right, let's take 3 more questions. We've got a gentleman in the back there in the kind of beigey jacket. Any other questions?
There's a woman here,
Where's the lady? I don't see
right
her.
here, and
Oh,
there's a guy over here.
okay, with the hat. And let's take one person from over there. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Hello, how are you? My name is Mohammed Afisa. I'm from Khartoum, Sudan. And I'm trying to ask my question in the nicest way, like speaking from a perspective of a non-US citizen. But
Where did you say you were from? I didn't catch
I'm
it.
from Khartoum, Sudan. So it's really unfortunate seeing what Russia did to Ukraine. But what I see as a global citizen, the US have been doing this for more than 20 years. Then why isn't there sanctions on the US? Is it because it's the biggest power? Does this make it like justifiable that, oh, there is no, because there isn't a power above the US to place sanctions on it. So where does this stand? And I'm asking this question seeking knowledge, not attacking or anything.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
it's a
you.
fair
And we have the
question.
lady here in this hat.
Thank you, everyone, for your great topics. I'm concerned about the 2024 election. And where do you think our focus is going to be, more globally or domestic, and how that's all going to resolve?
Okay. And we have the 3rd person over here.
Hi, I'm interested in the panel's perspective on the likelihood of any sort of uprising in Russia by the Russian people to remove Putin from power.
Okay. And then let's just take a 4th question because there was someone right here. And we'll try to get all of these in.
Thanks. Robin, I might have missed it, but I didn't catch your 5th bullet point.
Oh. It was about U.S. leadership,
yeah,
questions
yeah.
about U.S. leadership. Okay.
So I'll take the first question.
Yes, please.
Which is, you're right. You are right that the United States very often does what Russia is doing. Great powers shape the order historically by conquest. And the United States has recent failures and more historic failures to add to that list. So it is true that the United States makes mistakes, conducts aggression in the international order. What makes us marginally better than the Russians is the values that we attempt to hold ourselves to. And we don't always succeed at that, and we haven't particularly burnished our record in the last 20 years. I think the long shadow of the invasion of Iraq is going to raise questions like you raise for a very long time, and it should, because we too need to be accountable, not just for our successes, but for our mistakes.
Just on that point too, I would.
Me too.
Good. One difference and between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine is that the Russians want to dominate, they want to absorb, they want to conquer, they want to destroy. They want to wipe Ukraine off the map. They want to destroy it. And that was not the case for the United States going into Afghanistan. We didn't want it. We didn't want Iraq. Yeah, there was regime change, and we should be held accountable, absolutely. We made mistakes. We made earlier mistakes. I fought in a war that, looking back on it, was probably a mistake. So yeah, we should acknowledge those mistakes. But we should also distinguish between what Russia is doing now and trying to destroy a country, and from what we did in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, I have to say my heart goes out to your question. Whether it's Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, we may not be trying to wipe them off the map, but we are trying to replicate America in these countries and are often disrespectful or just ignorant of customs, traditions, religion, and so forth. And the way we have left Iraq and Afghanistan, Iraq had a democratic election in October and they still don't have a government. Afghanistan is a terrible mess now, suffering from a terrible earthquake. I spent 50 years of my life defending my country when I've been overseas. I am a descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and yet I am ashamed of my country because of the way we have abused what we claim are decent values and trying to improve the state of other nations, and we end up just screwing them up.
So on the question about Putin and is he vulnerable? Maybe, could well be. We don't know very well. We do have our fingers crossed, as Kori has. And it could well be. It's a lot, he's got a lot of problems. He's got China on his border. He's got people who are starting to figure out what's going on in Ukraine. Most Russians have a pretty positive view of Ukraine. You know, brothers or sisters or business, crime relations, whatever. They've got a lot of connections. And all of us, and Putin has not been willing to come clean with the Russians, saying what he's doing. He won't declare war. He won't mobilize. He declared a special military operation that you can't even, if you say it's a war, you go to jail. Right. So he knows he's got big problems. That said, I'm not sure there's anything we can do to push that along. And nor do I don't think we'd be very good at that. The Russians will do it.
Well, I'll say I was part of Hillary Clinton's traveling press corps when she made a remark on our way to, well, she made a remark when there were some uprisings in Russia, and boy, Putin didn't let her or the United States forget about it, and it turned out to be a worse mess, I think, because something had been said that they became so paranoid. So to Bill's point about that there's nothing we can really do about it. Okay, we're out of time, so just lightning round the 2024. I'd like to hear each of your answers on 2024.
I know how I'm going to vote.
No, I don't think she was saying how are you going to vote. I think she was saying what will our international focus be for the 2024? Are we going to be so focused on domestic?
Was it going to be global? Was it going to be local? And it's local.
What's that?
She asked if it was going to be global or local, and I said it's going to be local.
The best thing the United States can do to strengthen democracy in the world is actually to strengthen and revitalize our democracy at home.
Yeah. Well, on that note, please join me in thanking this amazing panel for giving us their time and insights. Thank you for coming.